What can God's grace do to us? Well, look at Colossians 3, because there's actually a series of 14 imperative commands right here in the book of Colossians 3. In the chapter 3 of Colossians. These are imperatives, starting in verse 1, and I'll just show you the imperatives. Remember, an imperative is God saying, this is what I want. Are you going to respond yes or no? See, an imperative is not a suggestion. It's God saying, I want this, and we have to either say yes or no. Here's the first one in verse 1. If then you were raised with Christ, or since you were raised with Christ, seek those things which are above. And the word seek is choose to look for. Now, in my Michigan years, I was a hunter here. They got me addicted when I pastored over there at Calvary for 9 years to deer hunting. And one of the men in the church owned a whole square mile, 640 acres. He had 30 stands and pit blinds all over his cornfields. And he would invite a group in, and you were always got a deer or two or three or however many tags you had. But one of my sons never seemed to get one. And finally I checked on him. He would come with me hunting, and he never seemed to get one. And I'd go to his stand, and he was reading a book. I said, you can't get a deer if you're not looking. If you don't look, if you don't seek them, they don't come to your stand and say, shoot me. They are out there doing life, and you've got to watch them and look for them. You know what Paul said? If you are risen with Christ, start looking for the things which are above. And it's a command. Set your sights not on things in the earth. You know how most Christians that struggle with death, do you know what it is? If heaven is over here, they are going through life looking at the world. Heaven's here, and they're backing toward heaven. It's like, oh, I'm getting so old, I can't do what I used to do. Oh, I'm going to leave behind my houses and here's heaven. They are being a tractor beam pulling them to heaven because they're saved, but their affections are where? On earth. See what it says? It says, seek those things which are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. And verse 2, set your mind on things above. Turn the scope of your life and the seeker toward things above. And so that the closer we get to the end of our lives, it's the destination we can't wait to get to is getting closer and closer and closer. Most people are backing toward heaven. And they look at earth as everything that they know and love. And heaven is just so mysterious, and kind of like Dave Hunt wrote a book once. It was titled, Heaven Can Wait. And he said it's kind of like the mantra of America whenever he wrote it in the 80s. I want my health, and I want my diet, and I want my travel, and I want my pictures, and I want my fun, and I want all the stuff and the activities and amusements. And I'm getting older and older and older, and I know heaven is back there somewhere, but I don't want to think about it too much because I'm thinking about this. And the whole premise of Colossians 1 is turn your orientation that way. And those are the first two imperatives. Seek the things above, set your mind on things on the earth. Then it goes on, and it says in verse 5, here's the next imperative, put to death your members which are on the earth. And it lists off everything the people in Colossae were struggling with. Remember what I told you it was like in Turkey? All the nudity. What's the first sin in the list? What are they supposed to put to death in verse 5? What's the first word? Fornication. Now, if you keep track, whenever the scriptures, either Jesus in the gospel or the apostles in the epistles, whenever they list off sins, there are 14 sin lists with multiple sins listed. If you ever put columns like this and look at the sin lists, like Romans 1 and here and all the other ones, do you know what's either first or second in every list? Fornication. Sexual sin. Why? Because the Roman Empire was so sexually charged, kind of like modern day time. Do you know what the New York Times says? It says that the primary portal of pornography has now become the mobile phone. That about 75 to 80% of all pornography right now flows through mobile phones. Why? Because you can be really all alone with your phone. And that is what has, well, the mission, I told you I spoke at that mission sending 250 to India. You know what the head of the mission told me? He said 10 years ago, we used to ask our students that were applying for missions whether they had ever been involved in any pornography. He said, we don't even ask anymore. We assume 100% of them have, and most of them struggle still. Now that's different. When I was a little boy, pornography was that awful stuff they sold in liquor stores, and it had paper, bags over it, and it was behind the liquor counter, and dirty old men would go to the liquor store and get it, and then it moved to the convenience stores, but they still had the covers over them, and then it moved into the stores, mainline, and then it moved into the movies, and now it's everywhere. And so most campus ministries working in America assume that both the boys and the girls. You ever heard of Tim LaHaye? Tim left behind LaHaye. He's now with the Lord. He said this. He says, when I was dating Beverly, he said they were in the military, and he said that Beverly came over to see me in my barracks, and he said it was kind of embarrassing because there were 40 men in the barracks, and there were 60 pinup girls on the wall, which is boys. They'd have their pinup girls. He said, I went over to visit Beverly's barracks, and there were 20 women in there and no pinup boys on the wall. But LaHaye said this, when he wrote this in the 80s, he said, if you go to the barracks, there's just as many pinup girls as boys. In fact, they've got shared barracks. He said that it's just totally corroded. And the internet and the accessibility of the smartphone has put a warp speed. It is exponentially going down to the threshold now that most kids are exposed to pornography at 8 and 9 and 10. And they're just, by the time they get to be 13, when Bonnie and I go and minister in Europe and train students that are saved in street ministry in Europe in their 20s, those kids have already done the whole alcohol thing. They've already done the whole drug thing. They've been sexually active for a decade, and they're only 20. 2, 3, 4, and they've been sexually active for a decade. And they come to Christ, and boy, are they fervent. Because they said, we know how empty the drugs are. We know how empty the alcohol is. We know how empty all that promiscuity is. And we have found Christ, and they become the most dynamic witnesses and experience what God's grace can do in us.